What about another one? Well, the second one he gives us is our own personal conscious states, right? So
Hmm.
what's he talking about here? Well, he says, in addition to the laws of logic and math, we have greater rational authority about what is happening, notice, inside our own conscious lives than any other person does, right? So I know more of what's going on inside of my conscious life than anyone else, and vice versa for everyone, every other individual. And so he says, how do we know our own conscious states? Notice, not by any scientific empirical means, but by direct introspection, right? So we don't do a scientific experiment to know what I'm thinking, right? Let me see, I have a headache. Let me do a scientific experiment to make sure. Well, no, no, no. We know that by direct introspection. We know that more thoroughly than we know any scientific claim, quite frankly, right? And so he says, assume for a moment that he's focusing on his inner life and he's not daydreaming. All right. So he says, in this state, I'm in a position to know what is happening in my own mental life with greater epistemic certainty than other people have in knowing what is in my conscious life. And so, a neuroscientist could know with greater certainty what's happening in his brain, how the neurons are firing and the chemicals are
Hmm.
moving from one, the synapses to another and so forth. But he cannot know with greater certainty what is going on in my mind, right? What my, particular introspection, conscious life is all about. And
Right.
so we have our own personal conscious states that are superior to scientific knowledge. They give us knowledge outside of scientific knowledge.
Right. So the neuroscientist can tell you that you're feeling sad because the chemicals in your brain are low, but they can't tell you why you're sad, or that the way out from being sad will release those endorphins and fluctuate your mind better. They can unnaturally medicate you to do that, but what's going on in your mind that is affecting your brain is not quite there. I do remember one of our early intro to philosophy classes. I think we spent probably more time than the professor wanted talking about whether or not we knew we had a headache. And I thought that was a fascinating moment of oh, I really want to study philosophy. So I distinctly remember that lecture a little bit more than we probably gave our professor a headache as well. So although we wouldn't know, well, only he knows, so he'd have to tell us. Well, one might think that the day will come in which scientists have so precisely correlated mental and brain states that a scientist could indeed know better than I what's going on in my mental life by simply reading my brain states. But this is not true. Why? Well, in order for a scientist to develop a detailed chart correlating specific mental and physical states, well, he must ask the experimental subject what is going on inside of them as he reads the brain monitor. Thus, any correlation chart will be epistemically dependent on and weaker than a subject's own introspective knowledge of his conscious states because the chart is dependent upon the accuracy of the experimental subject's reports of their own consciousness. And it reminds me of a Simpsons episode where Homer's brother renews his wealth by getting Maggie to talk using a machine. And so I've always wondered, like, oh, is that entirely possible? But that might be true for, a Maggie Simpson. I'm hungry, I'm cold, I'm wet. But is that true for everyone? Did it sell because it actually told the truth about what a baby was actually thinking? Well, it doesn't seem so because that's only one subject, right? So it always goes back to the Simpsons for me for this one.
Yeah, so they explain everything.
Yes,
He
exactly.
says a related matter is that consciousness exhibits private access. And so he tells us to take any physical entity whatsoever, a rock, an organic chemical, or a state of the brain. Any way you have of knowing things about the physical entity, size, shape, mass, is also available to me. So the same way you can know about it, how big it is, the shape of it, the mass, whatever, that's available to me. But he says that we have a way of knowing about our own conscious states that is not available to other people, direct introspection. And so these facts are privately accessible only to the individual. So he says, if all of this is so, then, we have a greater epistemic authority for knowledge of our own conscious states than we could ever have of the laws of nature and science.
Right, right. You're lying and I know you're lying. Well, you may be able to know one of those things, but you don't know if you know both of those things.